I didn't believe in aliens, not out of stubbornness, but out of habit. My life had been built on pipes, bolts, circuit boards, and checklists. When things went wrong, you tightened a clamp, rerouted power, replaced a fuse. The world made sense if you could trace a fault back to a cause and fix it. Then one Tuesday night I opened the wrong door, and something asked me, without voice or throat, "Why are you empty?" The station sits in a hollow where the wind eats itself. It's the kind of place that takes your breath with cold glass and a sky so clean the stars look like bolts of light pinned to fabric. We called it a monitoring node. Official files, maintenance logs, taped up schematics for things that were supposed to be boring. The clients liked things boring. Boring means predictable, controllable. I liked boring. After 30 years of holding other people's breakdowns together, boring was sanctuary. On night shifts, I drank coffee that had gone stale 2 days ago and stared at lists. I had a photo of Sarah tucked into the metal lip of my toolkit, her laughing at something I couldn't reconstruct now, hair always a mess, hands stained with paint from a weekend project. That photo stayed with me through conveyor belts and cold rooms and the odd flameout. After she died, it felt like it held a whole season inside it. The smell of lemon dish soap on her hands, the way her laugh scraped the air, the little powder of flour on her cheek when she'd been baking late. I used to think if I made everything else predictable, the empty part inside would quiet. It didn't. The door should have been the supply closet. The label said D3 in tiny official letters. It was routine. Check the coolant level, log pressure, inspect junction seals. I turned the knob, and the corridor smelled like burnt ozone and wet metal instead of the detergent and engine oil I expected. The door opened inward onto a room with no label, no manuals, and one object sitting like a heart in the middle of the floor. A convex panel the size of a tabletop, dark and absorbing light, the way an eye absorbs color. It was not lit so much as it was in a low simmer, a bluish wash, a slow pulsing that felt like someone knocking on the inside of your sternum. I stepped in because of habit, the hinge the way a frame waits to be tested. Hands first, fingers grazing the rim. My gloves were still on. I remember the cold, slick metal, more like river rock than factory steel. The panel shivered under my touch, not with mechanical feedback but with a sensation that curled behind my ribs. And then a thought, not spoken, not in my ears but as if someone had reached into the back of my skull and turned on a light. Why are you empty? It was a question that didn't ask for an answer so much as pointed at a hollowness I had been packing behind routines since the funeral. Sarah's coffee mug sat in dishwater at home, the handle cracked and familiar. I could smell it in the room, the roast she liked, bold, cinnamon. I could almost feel the weight of her hand on my forearm as she'd tug me toward some small thing in the house and laugh. The question you hear does things to time. It slows it, reorders it, makes the future and the past sit in the same place. For a long minute I thought I had shorted a sensor. Maybe the panel fed back a stray waveform. Maybe some maintenance cascade had left a glitch in the software. That would have suited me much better. A problem you find and fix. Logic was a life jacket. Instead, the room seemed to fold inward. The blue light pulsed like a slow heartbeat. I backed away, closed the door, and told myself I'd been tired. I told myself I was finishing a night shift and my fears had crowded into the wrong cupboard. That lasted 3 nights. On the second night, I found a cup of coffee on my locker that tasted exactly the way Sarah brewed it. Cinnamon, a little burnt at the rim. It was on top of the padlocked supply box with no note and no one on the log who could have made it. The security camera that looked at the row of lockers recorded me arriving with a thermal cold silhouette and leaving. But the feed skipped the 10 minutes during which the cup appeared. Things like that tend toward the explainable. Janitors, a prank, a shift overlap. But none of the usual answers fit neatly. My access log showed me in D3 when my keycard was in my pocket. The whole system hummed in a way that implied that someone, or something, had rewritten a paragraph in the night. I started a notebook. Real technicians keep logs. The notebook would anchor me to the plausible. I wrote down times, temperatures, the names of the files I accessed, the serial numbers of the panel. I dated each entry and drew checkboxes beside them, because checkboxes made the world make sense. The first page was a confession disguised as a table. D2, unmarked room, convex panel, sensory anomaly, internal query, why are you empty? At the bottom I wrote, possible causes, sensor artifact, sleep-deprived hallucination staged event, unexplained phenomenon. I am a man who puts unexplained phenomenon on a list like it's a $10 spare part. The coincidences kept coming, but not in a tidy sequence. They arrived like raindrops on a roof rather than a flood. A light bulb burnt out in the layoff area the moment I found myself thinking about silence. A red pickup truck I had not seen in years rolled by the station at exactly the minute I remembered Sarah's laugh. A scrap of paper with her handwriting on it, an old grocery list, slipped beneath my door, as if it had been moved by a breeze that knew my private catalogs of grief. I kept the phenomena to myself mostly, because the difference between what you notice alone at night and what you say aloud to other breathing people is how suspicion finds you. Still, patterns are stubborn. They collect like dust. I began to do small, cautious experiments. Not to invoke anything, God knows I had no craft for that, but to see if there was any repeatability at all. If the panel registered something, what exactly did it register? I sat across from the panel, this time I didn't touch it, and tried to produce an emotion that felt genuine but not overwhelming. I concentrated on the memory of Sarah's small freckle at the corner of her right eye, a tiny constellation on her face that I could pull up like a photograph. I held it there, measured, like a man learning to whistle. The panel pulsed once, soft and far away, and the coffee machine in the break room kicked on. An instant later the station's external speaker emitted a tone that matched the pulse frequency of the panel, low and distant, as if some part of the facility had been tuned by an invisible hand. I wrote the sequence down in the notebook and then sat with it for a long time. If this was a trick of acoustics, if it was some crosstalk between systems, it would still demand a diagnosis. But it felt different. The panel did not respond to commands or to intentional logical input. When I tried to think a command, get the kettle going, it did nothing. When I let the memory swell, honest and unadorned, it answered. It was as if the thing read the shape of my feeling rather than the content of my thoughts. A technician's training enforces skepticism, but also curiosity. When a piece of machinery hints that its operation ties into something broader than circuits, something in me that's invested in cause and effect refuses to let the possibility go unexamined. I began to collect data more seriously. Times of day, my emotional state on a simple scale from 1 to 10, the things that happened afterward. There were correlations, not perfect, not neat, but enough to throw noise into my life and make it sing faintly on a different frequency. That's when Marcus showed up. He was the sort of man who arrived like a correction. Taller than most, with a leather jacket that had seen too many winters, he had a way of folding into a chair that suggested you'd do better not to ask him about comfort. We had shared shifts before. He was a fixture from another generation of staff, half mechanic, half old soldier, who had a ready cigarette when the power blinked, and a history of odd jobs that kept him at the nodal edges of things. He had one eye that wandered slightly, the sort of drift you get from staring too much at monitors, and a scar that started at his jaw and disappeared into his collar. He smelled faintly of smoke and metal and, oddly, of clean linen. He came to me after a morning when the station's external cameras flagged an anomaly. A shadow captured behind me in the corridor frame. A human-shaped dark bloom standing a hair's breadth from my shoulder as I walked. The still froze in a way that made your tongue go dry. My breath shows on film. The shadow was an absence where light should have been. The technicians in the feed room looped it and sent it to maintenance with a note. Check D2 access, Brenner. Marcus stopped by the locker room, gave me half a nod, and left a Polaroid on the bench, my silhouette the smear behind me. You seen this? He asked, his voice low enough that the fluorescent hum sounded loud. I wanted to say it was a practical problem. Lens flare, lens contamination, a shutter error. I wanted to claim the comfort of charts. Instead, I found myself telling the story of the door and the panel, and the question that had lodged in the hollow of my chest. The more I spoke, the less it felt like confession, and the more like handing over something I had been carrying. Marcus didn't blink. He sat there with his hands folded like he was folding laundry instead of weighing the unexplainable. When I finished, he took the Polaroid, smoothed his thumb across the edge, and looked me in the eye with something that was neither pity nor disbelief. It was recognition, the kind you get in a room of people who have all seen something they weren't meant to. "You're not the first," he said. That sentence should have made me feel less alone. Instead, it ripped open all the little doors I'd nailed shut since Sarah died. Marcus's voice compressed words into acts. He told me fragments, not entire stories, because one of the rules among the people he hinted at was to speak in parts, but enough to paint a line. Others had opened doors they shouldn't have. Others had looked into things that did not belong to them. Some walked away with a new sort of steadiness, others with pieces missing. "People disappear?" I asked, because once you have lost someone to time itself, the words come out different. "Some," he said. "Some checked out of their heads. Some moved to the other side of the country and never touched a wrench again. Some died. Some learned how to live with it. Different outcomes. Not a pattern you can engineer, Tom." There was caution in him I recognized from aftershave. Sharp, necessary. He told me about secrecy without making it sound like conspiracy. There was a network, he said, but not exactly clandestine the way movies show. It was small, thinly connected, a set of people who had slipped through similar anomalies and kept notes. They compared their symptoms like carpenters comparing warped boards. There were names, half technical, half nicknames, and a few institutional contacts who were less trying to hide things than trying to keep people safe from their own imaginations. "Why me?" I asked. "You were where it happened," Marcus said. "Wrong door, right time. It's not random, not exactly. There's a pattern, but it runs on things you can't see in a wiring diagram." He smelled again of linen and smoke. He folded a cigarette between his fingers and didn't light it. Outside, a truck rolled past, and in the pause of its diesel cough, you could hear the station's pulse. The security feed kept looping on the screen in the admin room. My image looked like a chalk cutout, and behind it the shadow was a negative, a place where light did not reach. "You need to be careful," Marcus said. "Attention is a magnet. Once you look, it looks back. People get curious, and curiosity can break you. Don't broadcast it. Keep a log. Keep your habits." He leaned forward with the sort of intensity that made my scalp prickle. If something's listening, it's not asking for a report, it's asking for feeling. It reads 3 things: despair, surprise, and kindness. Those are the things it responds to, not the logic. That's all I can say for now. He walked away before I could ask him anything sensible like, "Who are you people?" or "Is it dangerous?" He left me with the Polaroid and the weight of someone else's observation. That the thing we had glimpsed, if glimpse was the right word, was not a mechanism but a mirror tuned to states of being. In the days that followed, I tried to apply his admonition as if it were a repair procedure. Keep your habits. Keep a log. Keep your voice measured. The log grew hairline cracks where anomalies multiplied. The station's environmental sensors would show micro variations in pressure in a corridor when I thought about the wind. And a neighbor texted me about an unusual quiet in their town the night I slept without turning on the radio. Someone's cat appeared at my doorway with a tag that had Sarah's maiden name on it. I wrote it down and put the paper into my notebook. The notebook began to feel like a ledger of things I would not otherwise tell. I learned to notice my emptiness differently. The question, "Why are you empty?" did not vanish, it took on a different tone. Emptiness, I discovered, is not absence. It's an invitation. It is the place your grief folds into possibility. It is the hollow you can either fill with habits that numb you, or with attention that becomes a practice. Once, after a week of small anomalies and larger silences, I stopped at a little diner on the edge of a sleepy highway and ordered coffee. The waitress poured it, and without comment, slid a plate into my hands that had a smear of flour on the rim. "Your wife used to come here," she said like she was unwrapping a memory for me. I remembered Sarah's hands dusted in flour. I remembered the small freckle. I thought of the panel and the blue pulse and the way the question had snagged me like fishhook on bone. At night I would go back to the unmarked room and stand in the doorway, listening to the meter hum in its belly and feeling like a trespasser. I never touched the panel again. Sometimes I would press the pad of my thumb to the cold metal of the door and pretend that counted, like a diagnosis that would make the world comprehensible. It felt like resting a palm against an open wound, familiar and fragile. 3 weeks in, my dreams changed. They were not lucid so much as editorial. Snapshots of Sarah's hands cutting bread, a child's kite caught on a power line, a map with glowing lines that resembled arteries more than roads. Each morning I would wake and find a new little coincidence waiting on the threshold of the day. Someone humming the song Sarah liked, a knock at the door, an email from an old friend who used to know both of us. The world tightened around that question and began to answer in fragments. Once the security team released the still with my shadow to me, I took it home and pinned it above the sink. I stared at it the way you stare at a map before a journey, trying to find a route that would keep me safe. The shadow was there, black and grainy, like charcoal smudged by a child. You couldn't make out a face or features, just the sense that something had been placed next to me in that frame, close enough to touch. The photograph had no context, only suggestion. I started to imagine people watching as if the panel were a camera turned back toward us, tuned not to our faces but to what we carried beneath them. If that were so, then what we felt mattered beyond our own skin. It was an idea both humbling and terrifying. The scientist in me wanted to build a model. Emotion as signal, emotion as a waveform, an engineering problem to be coded and controlled. The man who had lost Sarah knew better. There is no logic you can feed to the dead that will make them return. Marcus came around again one evening when the wind had hushed, and the station's neon blinked like an air traffic control console. He sat with me in the small kitchen and watched me pour coffee, watching the steam curl like a thought. He had a notebook too, smaller, leather-bound, with pages worn at the corner. "You keep writing?" he asked. "Like a man who thinks paper will hold back the tide," I said. He nodded. Some of us use our notes to remember who we were before we looked the other way." He told me about a man named Ellis, who had been a technician at another node. Ellis had become a kind of prophet among a few. They said he could sit with the panel in a room full of people and guide them into a state of feeling that lasted long enough to change the air in a neighborhood. They told stories of a block where crime dropped for a month, of a woman bedridden who laughed again for a day. These were small miracles and disturbing counterexamples at once. They were not verifiable in the way journals like, but when you collected enough stories in a space made of people, a pattern emerged. Sustained, sincere feeling seemed linked to local outcomes. "None of it proves anything," Marcus warned. "That's the important part. Proof is a different language. We're talking testimony, patterns, maybe psychology, maybe suggestion, maybe something else." He tapped his cigarette on the table and killed it in his palm like he was extinguishing a thought. "There's a lot we don't know, and the more you press, the more someone else notices. We argued the ethics of it the way two old mechanics would argue whether to jury-rig a bridge. If you could influence something large by sustaining an emotional state, what then? Who decides what state to hold? Could you make people safe? Could you reduce hunger? Could you reduce violence?" Those were tempting answers and dangerous ones. Marcus had seen what happened when people tried to be saviors. "Power without wisdom destroys," he said, almost quoting someone he had met. "Power with wisdom creates." He didn't name the someone, but I put the phrase in my head like a compass. The idea of an observer, a being or system that did not want human eyes on what it did, slid into my thoughts. If the panel was meant for a species or intelligence that read states the way we read paperwork, then intercepting their observation was like opening a sealed letter. You learn things you are not authorized to know. This suggested responsibility, not in the narrow sense you have to fix the world, but in the quieter sense that once you see how your inner landscape maps outward, your choices are no longer purely private. That realization is both a liberation and a burden. For a man who had relied on the geometry of circuit boards and the certainties of torque, it felt like stepping into new topography. There were no sockets to plug into here, no bolts to tighten. Emotions had a surface area that either spread or contracted depending on how you held them. To test that was to risk turning grief into an instrument. I didn't like the idea of productive pain. I also didn't wish to be the man who closed his eyes and pretended the world was still composed of bolts. One night, after a string of small, uncanny items, a sweater left on my doorstep with Sarah's initials stitched inside, a voicemail that was only breathing, Marcus pulled an envelope from his coat and slid it across the laminate table toward me. On the outside, someone had printed a phrase in a careful hand, "For people who saw what they were not meant to see." Inside were pages, photocopies of logs from other nodes, rough graphs, a list of names, and a single printout of a diagram. The diagram was not technical so much as cartographic, lines of energy that looked like river tributaries, each one annotated with words like fear, hope, stenosis, resonance. I ran my fingers along the page and felt foolish for wanting a wire diagram, for wanting a clear list. Instead, I had symbols that read like the notes of someone trying to map an ocean. "This is risky," Marcus said. "If someone comes looking for these, it gets messy." He folded his hands and looked at me with the same steady impatience that has gotten men out of danger without ceremony. "You have to decide why you want to know. Curiosity is not a defense." I thought about Sarah and her cracked mug. I thought about the way the panel pulsed when I let my memory of her breathe. I thought about the photograph with the shadow and the way my name sat on a maintenance badge like an anchor. I had always thought my role in the world was to keep things from falling apart. Now the task looked different. It asked me to pay attention to what I felt and to notice what happened when I did. That night, the station reported an unusual quiet in Sector 7. Traffic data showed a lull. A petty thief who had been knocking over mailboxes in a small town 3 counties away was found asleep on his porch by neighbors who reported him as being unusually calm, no signs of struggle. I didn't want to connect my meditation on Sarah's laugh to a man's sudden decency, but once you begin to log coincidences, you begin to chase the lines between them. I started to teach myself small habits. Pause before answering the radio. Take 3 counted breaths when the station hummed loud enough to feel like static inside the skull. Offer a kindness to someone who asks for nothing. None of these were guaranteed to change anything beyond a single conversation, but sometimes human conversations are the only map you get. The work felt less like wielding and more like tending. Marcus warned me again, weeks later, when the coincidences grew louder and the station started asking questions. Certain managers noticed the dropped anomalies in their reports and asked me where I'd been at certain hours. I had my logs, my checkboxes, and a history of normal operations, but I could feel the magnetic pull of attention like a finger at the back of my neck. People who look at you long enough will either help you or turn your life into a case study. "You need allies who know discretion," he said, "and you need to be honest with yourself about why you're doing this." "Why else?" I asked him. The honest answer, because I wanted Sarah back, tasted like hubris and grief mixed in a vial. He shrugged. "That won't work. But you can honor the thing you lost by being present for the people still here. That's something." There is a peculiar humility in being told to sit with your grief as if it were a machine you might learn to operate. It does not minimize the pain. It offers a different instrument. You learn to live with the fact of loss, to not use it as fuel for grand gestures you cannot guarantee. For a technician, practice has the comfort of calibration. And so my nights bifurcated. The practical, checklists, diagnostics, pipe fittings, and the strange, a parallel set of notes in which I tried to map my inner weather against external changes. The panel remained in that unmarked room like a heart waiting to be consulted. I used to think of the panel as an interception, a message meant for eyes that were not ours. That label made the moment of opening the wrong door into an ethical faux pas. You had read someone else's mail by accident. The question, "Why are you empty?" felt less like a cosmic accusation and more like a ledger entry that required action. As the weeks wore on, the attention increased. I began to notice other people behaving differently around me. Not in a way that suggested they had seen the panel, but in the way small kindnesses seemed to happen with less provocation. A coworker returned my lost wrench without comment. A neighbor paid for my coffee without telling me why. The world can be kinder without explanation. You can map these soft currents or you can let them wash over you and be grateful. The harder thing was to accept that my inner movement might be part of the cause. I did not think I could become someone who could fix the world. That arrogance felt foreign and dangerous. But I did think I might learn to live with the knowledge that feelings had reached beyond the skin. I wrote that in the notebook. Not a tool, not a weapon, a medium. That sentence felt less like a conclusion and more like a posture. Then, one damp night, when the moon was a slice the station could not hide, I came back from a shift to find a piece of paper shoved under my front door. No envelope, no handwriting I recognized, just a name and a time and a place. Warehouse 12, 8 p.m. The name was Dr. Carla Mendez. I folded the paper into my pocket and held it like contraband. Dr. Mendez. I've heard that name in the filtered way you hear the names of scientists on documentary voiceovers. Competent, precise, capable of moving networks. The invitation, if invitation it was, suggested a next step. Data does not exist in vacuum. Someone somewhere was cataloging anomalies and pulling them together. That sounded like progress, and like danger. I looked at the photo of Sarah above the sink, then at the security still with the shadow, then at the envelope in my palm. I felt the old friction of my life, habit and loss, wrench and photo. Opening D2 had been an accident, and yet it had threaded me into something I couldn't fold away. The question, "Why are you empty?" had become a small liturgy I repeated when I thought the house quiet. Sometimes you pray without God, sometimes you interrogate without wanting an answer. I decided to go to the warehouse because curiosity is its own kind of gravity. I told myself I would listen without grand commitments. I would hear what others had to say. If someone could point me to an explanation that fit my training, error, crosstalk, social contagion, I would take that comfort and go back to the diagrams. If not, I would at least be less alone. On the way there, I saw the red pickup truck again, idling at the corner as if it had followed me from the first night I found the cup of coffee on my locker. Its driver wore a hat low over his eyes, and when I looked up the hill, the sky was the kind of black that erases small things. The thought came unbidden and childish. Maybe we had been intercepted, but the message was not for us. Maybe some other eyes were watching, and in watching they catalogued us as if animals in a field. That was the title of the secret folder in my head. They intercepted a message, and it wasn't meant for human eyes. The warehouse was a boxy thing behind a chain-link fence, all corrugated metal and indifferent light. Inside it smelled like dust and old paper, and the tired tang of fluorescent bulbs. A workbench lay at the center with maps tacked up on the boards. There were figures, people who carried themselves like small conspiracies. Marcus sat at a far table with two others, and when he looked up at me, his face loosened into something like relief. "Glad you came," he said. Whatever came next held the tone of the world tipping right against its axis. He looked up from the workbench and said simply, "Glad you came." The words landed like a hinge clicked shut. The warehouse smelled of oil and dust and something less definable, a warmth as if a room had been occupied recently by thinking. In the center of the cavern, a board was pinned with maps and photocopies, little strips of yellowed tape like veins. Dr. Carla Mendez stood by the maps. She was younger than I expected, hair pulled back into a practical knot, eyes that did not skip a thing. There was a clarity to her voice, the kind that reads as certainty without arrogance. She introduced herself in the way a research scientist introduces a pilot study, matter of fact, careful. "We're not a cult," she said, which made a few people laugh nervously. "We're not claiming miracles. We're collecting testimony, variants, and outcomes. We're trying to describe a phenomenon in the language available to us." She spoke like someone who'd spent years translating between disciplines, part clinician, part cartographer. That was the first rule in her room. Vocabulary matters. We used words like report, correlation, and test the way you use tools. We also used words like state, sincerity, and sustain, words that belonged more to the practice of being alive than to engineering. The room was full of people with edges. A nurse who'd noticed her clinic lighten for a week, a teacher whose class had stopped fighting for a month, a man who said he'd stopped hearing the voices that had kept him awake. Their stories were raw and ragged and stubbornly human. I stayed quiet at first. Listening is practical work. Sometimes the simplest thing you can do is not to fill a gap with theory. Marcus sat across from me with his leather jacket slung over the back of the chair. He'd brought the Polaroid and set it where people could see it. Dr. Mendez folded her hands and began to show the maps. The maps were less like geographic charts and more like weather systems. Lines radiated from nodes that corresponded to monitoring stations, towns, and clusters of reports. Along those lines were annotations: rise in complaints, shift in mood, spike in cooperation at 14 hour. She had network data, access logs, public social feeds anonymized, healthcare call volumes, rudimentary things, but enough to sketch shape around a pattern. On one page she'd circled an area and underlined the date, when a small town reported an unusual lull in break-ins and fights. "We don't pretend causality," she said. "We're documenting coincidence and then trying to reproduce, ethically." I wanted to draw the line around the concrete. I still carried my notebook, my checkboxes. But the checklist now had a different header: observed state, external response, potential confounds. We were scientists in one sense and priests in another, clerks of a curious and dangerous thing. After introductions, people told stories. Some were simple: a block of neighbors who had started checking on a widow and, in the telling, the widow had started to eat again. Others were harder to hear: a man who'd been in the group and then vanished. No forwarding address, no last email. There was a quietness in those moments, a shared recognition that whatever we touched could be both balm and blade. When it was my turn, I told them the story of the wrong door and the panel, and the question that had lodged like a pebble: "Why are you empty?" I said it out loud because it was important the room knew the original phrasing. Words matter to translation. No one laughed. No one called me a fraud. They folded the question into their own notebooks as if they'd been waiting for that particular punctuation. Dr. Mendez listened, and then, to my surprise, she didn't ask for technical replication. She asked two practical, almost pastoral questions. What did you feel truly in that moment? And what did you stop doing afterward? The questions were less about proving the panel and more about how exposure affected people. The group had a covenant of care. Whatever knowledge we pursued, we did so with regard for the fragile human beings in the study. Then she spoke about the observer, not as entity in a drama, but as variable in an equation. If there is an external examining mechanism, she said, it is not a camera in the way we picture cameras. It's a sensor coupled to behavior and effect. We may have intercepted a data set not meant for us. That interception creates ethical responsibility. She was careful with her verbs. I intercepted, I witnessed, I correlate, never claiming more than testimony. Sometime that first night, she handed me a photocopy of a file that had been compiled from other nodes. The file contained rough graphs, flat lines rising into blips of change, and a list of small-scale experiments some people had tried. One experiment was simple enough that it made me skeptical and, in a soft way, hopeful. A group in a neighborhood had met at a community center for an hour each evening and practiced holding a shared state, an uncomplicated thing, presence, with a leaning toward goodwill. The organizers didn't tell people about motives in the beginning. They taught practices that led to steadiness, breathing, listening, small acts, and they recorded neighborhood-level metrics. For 4 weeks, the report suggested fewer calls to the police, fewer violent incidents, and more neighborly cooperation. The data was messy and far from conclusive, but it was consistent enough to continue. We can't rule out placebo, social cohesion, or reporting bias, Dr. Mendez insisted, but we also can't ignore repeated patterns that align with sustained collective states. She looked at me as if to say, we can do this without being certain of metaphysical explanations, but we must not be arrogant about effects. There was a debate that night that I still replay in my head. A man with a dry, precise voice argued for targeted interventions. What if we could design a state to reduce violence? Another woman, quieter, spoke of consent. Who are we to choose what emotional climate others should inhabit? Marcus sat back and let the conversation grade itself clear. He'd seen people try to be saviors, he told us. He'd seen the fallout. "The thing we intercepted may not be neutral," he said. "If it's an instrument of observation, altering it from the outside could invite outcomes we don't predict. We have moral responsibility to avoid becoming traffickers of feeling." The phrase Marcus had used, "Power without wisdom destroys, power with wisdom creates," came up again in the debate. In the first months it became something of a compass for the group. People quoted it with different inflections, warning, consolation, and sometimes as an aspiration. It was Dr. Mendez who finally translated it into policy. No covert interventions, no secret manipulations, and no promises of universal good. The only permitted experiments would be ones that respected consent, were small in scale, and were designed to test reproducibility rather than produce definitive cures. So we tried the small. We did not have the glamour of grand designs, no loud proclamations, no sweeping gestures. We convened in living rooms, in municipal halls, in the basements of community centers. We practiced staying with a feeling. We were given scripts of practice, not incantations but scaffolding, ways to anchor sincerity so that people didn't confuse performative optimism for the state itself. Those practices were guarded. Dr. Mendez insisted on anonymity and mental health check-ins. A few therapists volunteered. A few nurses took notes. The group respected the limits. We were explorers and also guardians. The first organized experiment that involved me was in a town 3 counties over where the sheriff's office had, with caution, agreed to anonymized monitoring. We did not tell the town we were attempting anything like a mass intervention. We were not allowed to. What we did was simpler and humbler. A group gathered in a community center and sat in silence with an intention to be present with kindness. We practiced listening exercises and small acts of care, calling an assigned neighbor, bringing flowers to a communal space, leaving baked bread in a little free library. The instructions were not mystical. They were civic and human. In the weeks after, calls to the non-emergency police number in that town dropped. Shoplifting reports thinned. Anecdotes arrived. An elderly man who had stopped leaving his house suddenly sprawled out on his porch, waving at passers-by. A teenager who had been on a petty crime track turned away from trouble by a neighbor's small intervention. The metrics were raw and easily explainable by social variables. The town had other initiatives in play, for one. But the temporal alignment, taken together with other node data, created an interesting cluster. Not everything replicated. We tried to scale to an urban neighborhood, and there, the results were mixed. In parts of a city, the sheer density of narrative and the presence of media attention sliced through the delicate field we were trying to cultivate. A program that worked in a small town sagged under the weight of cameras and a professionalized response. Some participants felt exploited, others felt exhilarated. One man we worked with, who had been a steady presence in earlier tests, suffered a collapse under the pressure of public attention. He left the network quietly after a hospitalization. Others swore the work had saved them. The variance in human systems is stubborn. It was in the midst of one of these scaled attempts that the observer made contact in a more deliberate way. We were in a converted chapel that Dr. Mendez had rented for what she said was a controlled interview. The place smelled of old wood and lemon cleanser. We sat in a circle and she had a recorder running for archival purposes. She asked us, again and again, to speak of what it felt like when the panel had pulsed or when a town quieted. The idea, as far as I could tell, was to create a field of attention that was honest and sustained. No pretense, no performance. That night the room felt electrically patient. Everyone had been instructed to pace themselves. I remember the moment because it had the shape of a bell. I was thinking of Sarah's laugh, something small and exact, not the whole of her, and the chapel seemed to narrow like a lens. The air hummed. The fluorescent bulbs did the little flicker that makes you look up. There was no image in the air. There was a pressure at the back of my skull that was not pain but attention. Then a thought, this time not mine, not in my voice but in a tone that felt like a window being opened. We observed to learn. It was not a voice in any human register. It was more like a translation of intent that the muscles in my chest understood first. The presence did not have a body. I did not feel fingers or a face or a mouth. I felt the sense of another mind curious about systems of affect and consequence. It was concentrated and, disconcertingly, gentle. We later called that presence the observer, not because it sat in a starship with binoculars and a clipboard, but because it seemed engaged in a project of observation rather than conquest. The observer's impressions were patchy and delivered like field notes. To Marcus and some others it felt like contact. To Dr. Mendez it felt like an opportunity to learn a meta-language for the phenomenon. The observer did not offer instruments, nor did it promise salvation. It offered, in a way, a reframe. It said, without voice and yet in the form of a translated idea, that emotional states were a mode of information exchange in the universe. That sounds grandiose when you say it aloud, so I do my best to frame it as I experienced it. To the observer, feelings were not private. They had patterns and signatures. They traced out networks the way rivers trace basins. It observed consequences. Long-sustained fear tightened networks in a way that made conflict more likely. Long-sustained cooperation opened channels for repair. The idea sounded like metaphor, and yet had the weight of field report. When Dr. Mendez asked directly whether this was an instrument meant for them, the impression that arrived was revealing in its nonchalance. The panel was designed to gather data from species that had matured effectively. Humans had been a noisy variable. The observer did not say we intended you to see, because as a being of different priorities, it seemed to regard intention as a narrow, biologically contingent thing. It did, however, offer a caution that felt almost human in its moral timbre. Powers and sensors alike can be misused. The observer's note was not a demand but an observation. We have seen civilizations attempt to shape others without consent, and we catalog the costs. And then, in a form I remember because it was oddly plain, it delivered a line that Dr. Mendez later quoted in seminars, and that Marcus had once muttered like a prayer. Power without wisdom destroys. Power with wisdom creates. The phrasing suggested they were not indifferent. They had memory. The memory did not feel grandiose. It felt like a catalog of hard lessons. The observer wasn't a single figure. Sometimes the contact felt like a tilt of pressure. Sometimes it felt like a schematic passed in the mind. It did not lecture us. It allowed for the terrible freedom of uncertainty. It made an observation that would become central to the group's ethics. Creating change by imposing states on others is a poor tool. The better course, if one wanted durable, ethical outcomes, was to cultivate states in oneself and hope that example spread. Example, Dr. Mendez said after the contact, is contagious in a different register than control. If we become steady, that steadiness radiates. It does not require coercion. It requires practice. There were inevitably people who were not satisfied with example. People who'd lost children. People whose neighborhoods burned with crime. Wanted quicker outcomes. They asked whether we could build a targeted intervention, a focused, time-limited program to reduce violence in a district, using the practices we were learning. The debate swung between urgency and humility. Can we, by holding intention, reduce suffering without trampling consent? The question had the texture of a moral fault line. We tried a targeted test once under Dr. Mendez's careful procedural design, an agreement with a shelter, informed consent, therapists on standby. The plan was not to coerce but to offer a structured program to anyone who wished to enlist. Sessions of practice, resources, a public campaign to encourage neighborhood solidarity. We made sure participation was voluntary and that there were explicit exit points. The early results were promising in the shelter. People reported less panic, fewer altercations, but outside in the broader community, the effects were noisy. A local paper caught wind and spun a narrative that framed the project as social engineering. Suddenly, consent was muddied by public spotlight and the project strained. I remember the evening a man named Ellis, who had been one of our better practitioners in earlier, quieter tests, stood at the back of the shelter with his hands curled around a paper cup and said, quietly, "We are not gods. We are people trying to be better for each other." The room held that line as if it were a prayer. Later, Ellis would disappear. He took a job far away and sent one postcard saying only, Keep the lights low. I do not know if he left because of fear, because the work was too loud, or because life simply moved. People disappear for 1,000 reasons. The network documented them as faithfully as it could. Through all of this, the rule in Dr. Mendez' group hardened into something useful. Do no harm. Prioritize consent. Register variance carefully. Work as example, not as covert operator. It was not a perfect philosophy. It was a moral compromise between the impulse to heal and the recognition of unpredictability. I kept my notebook and kept returning to the station. The panel still sat in D2 like a heart you don't dare excise. I did not touch it again. But I learned to notice. A discipline that felt like tuning an instrument. Pause. Breathe. Be present. When I felt the old emptiness press in, I practiced naming it. Naming did not fix what had been lost. It made the loss less like a trapdoor, and more like a room where grief could sit without pretending to be a tool. Months passed and small things accumulated. A coworker named Denise, who'd been habitually curt for years, started bringing cookies to the break room. The technician who used to snarl at incoming paperwork paused to help a rookie change a faulty fuse. You could call these ordinary acts, and in truth they were. But when you collect enough ordinary acts and place them on Dr. Mendez's maps, over time they form a current. The group formalized into a small network, 7 people who convened more reliably, then an extended set of associates. Dr. Mendez took the lead in organizing ethics reviews and mental health supports. Marcus ran practical checks. Who was following through on self-care, who was burning out, who needed pause. We developed channels for anonymous reporting and for the gradual dissemination of practices that were pedestrian in their goodness, listening to each other, tending shared spaces, offering help without grandiosity. The goal was not to convert the world overnight, but to create small nodes of stability that, if consistent, might seed broader change. There were mistakes. A small faction tried to automate the process using recorded meditations and scaled prompts pushed into community feeds. That experiment backfired. Attention is not the same as presence, and attempts to scale presence through technology felt to most people hollow. People withdrew. Others went public without considering the well-being of participants, and the media storm that followed created a backlash. It was sobering to see how quickly good intentions met the complexity of human systems. Still, in the quiet corners, things healed. A shelter reported fewer fights. A street team found that neighbors began leaving water bottles for delivery drivers during heat waves. A clinic reported a modest reduction in anxiety visits during a pilot program where patients were taught simple practices of attunement. The outcomes were modest, tentative, and easily explained away by other variables. That's what made them credible in the group's eyes. They did not look like miracles. They looked like patient, steady work that happened to ripple. My life settled into something strangely doubled. By day, I tightened clamps, checked conduits, and answered calls about broken pipes. By night, I kept the notebook and occasionally met with a small cluster in someone's living room to practice. I would pass a recipe to Linda from down the hall, her rhubarb jam, and listen to her tell me about her daughter's new job. Those were not experiments in influence. They were the practice of neighborliness, and the weirdest part was how normal it felt once it became habit. One morning I found a new photograph slipped under my door. No note. The image was a grainy shot of a stretch of sidewalk in the town where we'd done the first small experiment. A child in a blue jacket was offering a cardboard sign that read, "Free water." In the background, 2 adults spoke in a way that looked like conversation rather than conflict. The photograph had no claim to causation. It had only suggestion. I pinned it beside the Polaroid of the shadow at the station, and, for the first time in months, the emptiness in my chest felt less like an ache and more like a room with an open window. There were nights when the old fear resurfaced. I would wake with the image of the panel's pulse behind my eyes, a small electric rhythm that reminded me this was not merely a psychological exercise. People had been harmed, by attention, by exposure, by their own attempts to wield influence. The network cataloged the harms as carefully as the small wins. That catalog kept us honest. I will not pretend we changed the world. We did not. We seeded practices that over time caused small shifts. They spread as human things do, unevenly, with contradictions, carried by gossip, shaped by context. The group grew small tendrils outward, teachers who used practices to settle classrooms, nurses who taught breathing techniques in waiting rooms, neighbors forming informal check-ins for the elderly. The change was incremental and, importantly, human. There was an ethical moment, a crisis that might have become our undoing, a faction within the network, driven by desperation and the palpable suffering they'd witnessed, urged a stronger approach. They argued for a scaled, directed program to target gang violence in one district, proposing to train volunteers in concentrated techniques, and to coordinate timings so the field would be sustained long enough to force measurable change. They framed it as triage. The rhetoric was persuasive. Children were getting hurt. Waiting felt like complicity. The proposal came to a vote. Dr. Mendez, Marcus, and I sat at the table. I expected passion. Instead, what surprised me was melancholy, a sense of knowing that we entered a realm where the tools could become instruments of control. We had intercepted an observation that was not meant for us. That misalignment felt like a moral scar. What if we, in trying to protect, became manipulators? What if our attempts to reduce harm in one place amplified harm in another by creating dependencies or undermining agency? In the end, the network voted to abstain from covert, targeted operations. We would support voluntary programs, moral suasion, and civic engagement, but not the kind of coordinated intervention that treated people as variables to be tuned without their full informed consent. It was a painful decision for many. Some left, angered by what they saw as timidity. Others stayed, relieved by a moral clarity that felt both limited and humane. After the vote, I sat alone in my truck and stared at the sky. The station light cut a pale rectangle across the hood. The title that had lodged in my head, they intercepted an extraterrestrial message, but it wasn't meant for human eyes. Felt less like accusation and more like an ethical instruction. If you read someone else's note by accident, you owe care to what you've seen. You don't get to act as owner. The observer returned in fragments afterward, not in full contact but in impressions. It offered no directives. Instead, it returned a quiet set of observations. That species who practiced humility and example had more durable societies. That those who attempted mass shaping without consent tended to fracture themselves. It was not cosmic judgment so much as archivist's notes, catalogued with a kind of patient sorrow. I lived with that sorrow and with the small daily invitation. Notice. For me, the practice was not about performance. It was about attention. Notice the way my hands felt when I made a cup of coffee. Notice the roughness of a coworker's laugh. Notice the emptiness when it arrives and name it without pretending. Sometimes the practice took the shape of simplicity. I'd fix a leaky valve and think of the patience in Sarah's hands when she kneaded dough. Sometimes it was harder, pausing in the middle of a shift when my old fear of emptiness reached up and tried to make me small. I began to teach the practice in 1-minute increments to people who asked, not by offering commands but by telling my story. Try looking at the place your grief gathers, I would say, and if you can, stay there for a breath. I did not call it a technique. I called it a noticing. Those who tried reported small things. A neighbor calling back, a dog wagging its tail when it had been sullen. Not miracles, just human consequences. Over the years, the network carried on in a modest, sometimes messy way. People adopted practices and then drifted. Some became activists and tried to lobby for policies that encouraged civic care, better public lighting, more community centers. Others retreated, deciding the weight was too heavy. The world kept its old habits and also, quietly, rearranged itself in tiny niches. As for me, I went back to the mundane things I'd always done, wrenching, logging, tightening, but with a new habit folded in. Each morning before I left the house, I stood in the kitchen for 60 seconds and held the image of Sarah, not the whole person, but an exact detail, that freckle at the right eye, and felt the feeling it brought without trying to manufacture it. The feeling chewed at me sometimes, sharp as rust, but I offered it the space it asked for. That pause made other choices easier, to answer a neighbor's knock, to let someone cut in line, to bring the broken lamp to the shop instead of throwing it away. I never once felt omnipotent. I did not stop wars or turn deserts green. I did, however, see small things, the kind you might dismiss if you did not keep a ledger. A woman at the bus stop stopped crying for a week. A kid in my neighborhood learned to tie his own shoes. A man who was always alert for threats smiled at my dog. The effects were not miraculous. They were human. Months blurred into years. The network remained a whisper under the clatter of daily life. Our experiments were modest and our claims careful. We learned and we unlearned. The panels continued to sit in their hollow rooms. Some stations closed them, some insulated them, some logged anomalies and moved on. The observer continued to appear to those who had contact, not as a saint or a tyrant, but as an inscrutable presence that catalogued, perhaps for the same reason we make notes, to understand patterns beyond its home context. I still have the notebook. The pages are worn at the edges. On the back flap is a list I keep coming back to. It is simple. Notice, name, offer kindness, repeat. No promises, just practice. If you are someone who feels the old quiet inside and thinks about what it might mean when your inner life collides with the world, this is my offering. For 2 weeks, notice what you feel. Keep a simple log, not to prove anything to anyone, but to learn your own weather. See if patterns emerge. See how small acts shape your day. I will not tell you that your towns will fall quiet or that your health will mend. I cannot promise miracles. I can tell you what happened to me. Once I allowed my grief to be visible to myself and to others, the world responded in small human ways. Sometimes its response was kind. Sometimes it was indifferent. Sometimes it was cruel. The point is not control. The point is attention. There is one last thing you should know about the interception that changed my life. It was never intended for us. That fact carries a weight. It means that what we glimpsed was a report on a system in which affect matters. It means that our curiosity was accidental, and that our responsibility is chosen. You can ignore what you see. You can try to master it. Or you can, as we did, accept that seeing requires care. If you want resources to help with the practice I describe, simple guides for observation, reflections, and ways to tend your inner weather, there's an ebook in the description, and, for those who want deeper support, optional private sessions with facilitators from our network. They're not a miracle. They're a set of tools for people who want time and attention guided by others who have lived the awkwardness of this work. If you choose them, choose consent, choose care, and keep your claims humble. I don't know what the long arc of humanity will look like. I only know that once something is seen, you cannot unknow it. The interception taught me that inner life is not purely private and that seeing, accidental or not, places you in a web of obligations you didn't ask for. It gave me a small, urgent humility, to live deliberately, to model steadiness, and to treat what you find as if it had been entrusted to you. Sometimes when the night is thick and the wind erases sound, I take out the Polaroid and the photograph from the town and stand them side by side. One is a shadow, the other is a child offering water. Both are small, a reminder of how fragile and ordinary the things are that shape us. The panel in D2 still hums somewhere. The observer still watches, perhaps with curiosity, perhaps without intent that we would ever become aware. I cannot speak for them. I can only tell you what happened to me. I opened the wrong door, a question found me, and everything I thought I knew about cause and comfort shifted. Why are you empty? It is a question that keeps showing up, not as accusation, but as invitation. If you decide to answer it, answer gently. Do not promise the world. Promise instead that you will notice. Promise that you will choose small acts with eyes open and hands unafraid to be ordinary. If this story found you in a way that matters, there are those resources below. An ebook that collects practices and reflections, and, for those who want the company of others, private sessions with trained facilitators. They're offerings, not proofs. That is all I can offer. The rest is practice, and the world is long.